Yeah, okay, so this is from Stonewall to Trans Pride, a radical history of LGBT plus liberation. And it's great to see so many people here, and I guess part of the reason so many people are here is because of what's actually been happening around the whole kind of trans issue, war on trans, and so on. And I think it wouldn't be right to start this meeting without actually talking about the murder of Breonna Jai, nearly 2 weeks ago now, which has led to, I think, a real kind of outpouring of hurt, anger, outrage, and so on. People will, I know you had a very large vigil, didn't you, here in Manchester? We had a large one. It wasn't as big as I think yours was. People probably want to talk about that in the discussion. But we had a large one on Saturday in Leeds, and I know up and down the country there have been a whole bunch of these, and the tone of these has really been one of outrage and anger and real, absolute sadness about what happened. And I have to say, I spoke at the one in Leeds, and I had to say, that on hearing about Breonna's murder, I was kind of shocked and I was devastated, but I have to say I wasn't actually that surprised. And the reason I wasn't surprised is that there's so much kind of hate and transphobia which has been pouring out over the recent years, but it seems to be accelerating. That sooner or later, hate words become translated into hate deeds, don't they? And this is what's happened. I think the size of they weren't kind of strictly speaking protests in most places. They were vigils really, but the size of them much bigger than the vigils on Transgender Remembrance Day back in November 2 or 3 months ago, gives a kind of an indication of just how many people want to fight back. And it's not just trans people, non-binary people who want to fight back. It's cisgender people as well want to offer solidarity, and there were lots of them at the vigil on Saturday in Leeds. And of course now, this actually throws up all sorts of questions about, if this is some kind of moment, the size of the vigils and so on. It raises all sorts of questions about how do we best fight back? How do we best organise? How do we take the struggle, for trans rights forward? How do we roll back the attacks that have been, pouring down really for some time now? I'm going to come back to that because a bit later on in the talk, because these are kind of political questions, aren't they? I mean, like anything else that we in the SWP get involved in, we're not there simply to cheer on the protests and cheer on the vigils, same as the strikes that are going on at the moment. We always try to generalise, we try to build unity, to push the struggles forward, but also to ask, the fundamental questions really about how do we win? These are important questions, and fundamentally, how do we win? Come in. How do we win? Speaker never minds getting interrupted by more people. Okay, so as I say, it raises all sorts of questions because we address these questions from particularly a socialist and Marxist perspective. But of course, there are all sorts of other political approaches in the movement, and that, I'm sure that was the same in Manchester, but certainly in Leeds, there were people who were talking about privilege, talking about intersectionality, who were very distrustful of not the whole of the Labour Party, everybody in the Labour Party, the kind of autonomist distrust of people, even though actually one of the speakers at our vigil was Richard Bergen, MP, who's been very good on anti-racism issues and so on, and actually the leader and co-leader, vice leader of the council, Labour councillors, both of them gay. So actually there's kind of nuances within that. I think we kind of we have to kind of address as we go on. So I'm going to come back to some of that stuff a bit later on. I'm notoriously bad at timing, so I don't know whether you want to sort of just shut me up at some point, but after give me 10 minutes warning or something, or 5 minute warning. Is that okay? Okay, so this is these meetings that are taking place are part of LGBT History Month, which probably most people are aware, but was kicked off in the US actually in 1994, in the middle of the horrors that were going on around HIV/AIDS and all the accusations, the homophobia, this sort of notion that it was a gay plague and that nobody was interested because it was only gays dying. Actually, it was also trans women involved in sex work, were also a high risk group. And of course there were other groups that were high risk. But it was kind of written off at the time. And the idea of LGBT History Month was to raise the profile of LGBT people and to remind both LGBT people and straight and cisgender people that actually there is a history of fight back, there is a history of resistance. It kicked off in this country in 2005, which was a couple of years after the notorious Section 28 was rescinded by the Labour government. It did take the Labour government 6 years from winning the election in 1997 to bring themselves to rescind the legislation, but eventually Tony Blair and the government actually did it. And so, again, it was kicked off there. It was very particular in this country, and has been. It's been focused quite a lot on education, schools, colleges and so on, because Section 28 was a piece of legislation which forbade any discussion of gay lives, gay lifestyles as some sort of what they called a pretended family relationship. And it prevented teachers from talking about anything to do with gay lifestyles and LGBT lives at all. And of course it also made it incredibly difficult for teachers to come out and be open, incredibly difficult actually for school students either to come out and be open in their schools. Actually, nobody was ever prosecuted under Section 28, but it was a real kind of disciplining mechanism that took an awful long time to overcome. One of the things that's talked about a great deal in LGBT History Month is Stonewall. That's part of the title of our meeting tonight. Stonewall, people will be aware, was it was an inn. It was a Stonewall inn. It was actually a really seedy bar run by the mafia in New York, which was regularly raided by the police. They had an arrangement where they would kind of pay the police to tell them when they were going to raid. They would come along and they would harass the clientele, and sometimes arrest some of them, and then they kind of go away. Nobody's really sure what happened actually, but somebody either didn't pay off the police correctly that night or whatever, but the police raided. It was kind of unexpected, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and there was an eruption of resistance against the police. The police were driven out of the bar, and it led to 4 nights of rebellion on the streets of around the bar in New York. And there is, I deal with it in a bit more detail in the book. Copies at the front afterwards. But there's some great stuff, stories about some of the queens kind of high-stepping, in a line like the Tiller. Anybody remember the Tiller girls? High-stepping down the street, in front of the police. And then when the police would charge, they'd break up and kind of rush around the back streets and get hold of rubbish and chuck it at the police and so on. And they were singing very, very bawdy songs to talk the police about having no underwear and stuff like this. You could read all this for yourself in some of the material. But it was, the point about this was that it was a watershed moment, because prior to Stonewall, you know, most LGBT people didn't think of themselves as anyway as kind of really militant or, you know, having kind of real pride in being who you were. After Stonewall, when that news spread around the world that, you know, gay people, you know, lesbians, gays, and actually trans people had fought the police to a standstill, you know, and the way in which that kind of built on all the upheavals of the 1960s as well, you know, all the student revolt, the anti-war movement and so on, all of that came. It was like, it's our turn now in 1969. And, you know, from there you get the development and the emergence of Gay Liberation Front. You get the emergence, you know, the organisation of Prides, kind of the first Pride to commemorate the rebellion took place the next year. Very difficult. You know, we take it for granted now that, you know, Prides are just a kind of a feature that take place in the summer. They are, you know, I mean, all of them really have lost their radical edge. One of the things I think we should be doing as kind of radicals and socialists is trying to re-inject, you know, the notion of pride as protest. Instead of having a good day out, you know, and probably having to pay for the privilege of doing it as well, get a wristband and all this kind of stuff. Actually, you know, initially it was a couple of hundred, actually very brave lesbians and gays and trans people marching down the street, being abused by the police, being abused by passers-by. Now actually it grew as it went on, more people joined and so on. But it's a very brave thing to do, which we can kind of lose sight of. What is it, over 50 years ago now? We can lose sight of just what courage that took. And it was, you know, it was a fantastically kind of seminal event and really important for us to commemorate. There are other, you know, periods of campaigns of resistance and so on that took place as well. Think about in the 1980s, for example, lesbians and gays supported the miners. If you've seen the film Pride, that kind of covers that sort of period in which one of our comrades actually was quite heavily involved at the time, which was an attempt to kind of build solidarity between, you know, LGBT plus people and, you know, the miners on strike at that time. And the film, I think it's a brilliant film, but it kind of, you know, it talks about why that's so important and why it's actually still important, absolutely still important today. You then had the whole fight, people organising over trying to get research done for cures for HIV/AIDS. You had the formation of organisations like ACT UP and so on, right through, which actually, that was the period in the 90s, those kind of struggles around those sorts of things that drew together the T with the LGB. I remember in my union there was a kind of a set piece debate. I'm in the UCU. I'm retired now actually, but I'm still in the UCU. And there was actually a debate about whether our LGBT group should be an LGBT group or an LGB group because the T should be kept separate. It was kind of, that was actually the debate that I came out in the, you know, during that debate, because I felt very strongly that it should be LGB with the T, and that was being opposed. And in order to put the argument, I kind of came out from the forum. I mean, some of my friends, so people, a lot of people knew privately about me anyway, but I wasn't out formally. Anyway, it was kind of the right thing to do at the time. So, moving on. Yes, right. I don't know how long I've got now. Anyway, I knew there's lots more I need to say. Okay, so I think just a word. Oh, yeah, okay, 10 minutes, good. Okay, so the context. The context today is one of an escalating war on trans people and trans rights. And that's because, and this is, you know, it's very important we understand where this is coming from. I know people get very exercised about the minority people on the left and kind of gender critical people, and quite rightly in some ways, but actually these attacks have originated from the right and the far right. They originated really in the USA, very consciously, in the same way as the religious right in particular decided they were going to organise a campaign around abortion, which they have done, and unfortunately has been very successful in the USA. The overturning of Roe v. Wade a few months ago is a testament to that. But one of the other kind of wedge issues, if you like, that they want to drive in is the question of trans rights. And they're very consciously, there are quotes from people who say, the weak spot of LGBT rights is actually trans. And if we can undermine trans, if we can split the T from the LGB, we can then attack LGBT rights in general, and of course women's rights. Because actually, if I don't say this now, I was going to say it later, LGBT rights and trans rights are also women's rights. Because trans women are women. And actually what we should be doing is we should be uniting with women to fight against the impact of austerity, and this should be done as a united front, and we should not accept at all that there's any conflict between trans rights and women's rights. I think that's pretty fundamental to a kind of socialist position. I mean, I haven't got time to go into all the detail or anything, but clearly what's happened in Scotland over the gender recognition reform bill has been quite seminal in raising the issue. I mean, it seems to be item 2 or 3 on every Sunday news broadcast these days. It was they in the Scottish Parliament introduced the amendments that were proposed for the UK Parliament, or for the England and Wales back in 2017 as a result of the proposals by the Women and Equalities Parliamentary Committee. And they included things like lowering the age for social transition from 18 to 16, and of course introducing some form of self-ID, self-recognition, instead of the 2-year-long, demeaning, pathologised process that currently exists. And people began to organise against that. It's great that they passed that in Scotland. And all this nonsense about it's being foisted on people without any debate is actually nonsense. There's 6 years of discussion and consultation and so on. And then, of course, Sunak's Tory government decided to block it using the Scotland Act. And that has created a constitutional crisis because, what else can they block? But also, it has blocked for trans people a liberalisation and made life harder, made life worse than it would otherwise have been. This is in the general context, by the way, that I think there are now something like 25 other countries and jurisdictions which now have some form of self-ID, including Spain has just passed one, Finland has just passed one, Ireland has had one since 2015. It's the same act as the UK one, but it's actually got self-ID. And there have been, I'm pleased to tell you, there has been not a single incident in relation to the Irish, the granting of gender recognition certificates for Irish people. Not a single one has been rescinded because of unacceptable behaviour by some trans person has got a recognition certificate. Not one. Which kind of, again, I'll chuck this in now, but actually the evidence, the so-called evidence, which the transphobes and the gender critics try to put forward as to why trans people should be excluded from the spaces that we've been using for decades, public toilets, changing rooms, and so on and so on. There isn't any evidence, all right? There is no evidence. If you look for stuff, you will not find it. Even if you find an example, there was the example of Isla Bryson. Got her surname now.
Bryson.
Yeah, thanks. Who was convicted of rape before she transitioned. She actually was almost certainly never going to get to a women's prison. That's a whole other issue, by the way, because of the risk assessment process that people have to go through. Every remand prisoner and convicted prisoner has to go through an individual risk assessment process to determine which prison estate they are going to be in. That all the furore around that has made things actually a lot worse now for trans prisoners. because even if you now have a gender recognition certificate, you cannot go to the gender in which you live. You go to what is your birth assigned gender, even if you've got a certificate. Okay. Right, moving on quickly. Okay, there's lots of other examples. People, no doubt, aware of them. I can bring them up. I won't spend any more time on that. But I think the key thing is we need to be aware that this is coming from the right, that it is part of the kind of culture wars on woke and so on. And I think here we need to bear in mind that culture wars are really actually a class war. It's class war, and it's class war on the working class. All of this is intended to divide us, to make it easier for the ruling class to continue to rule in the way that they have done, and to make it harder for us to organise. If we're looking over our shoulder at somebody who is, I don't know, somebody who's black, somebody who's gay, somebody who's trans, as if they're getting more than we are, refugees and asylum seekers being the other key attack, point of attack at the moment, then we're not uniting as best we can. We're not focusing on the real enemy. I mean, that's why the strikes are so bloody brilliant, actually, because you can raise all these issues about, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, the role of the fascists, trans rights, and so on, and get a good hearing, because people understand the enemy is your management, your boss. The Tories who are pushing through massive attack on our living standards and so on. It's much easier to do that when we're all stood on the picket lines, in rallies and so on, than it is when we're not. That's really important. Okay, why is the UK so bad? Just a couple of other things for you. Why is the UK so bad? I think probably 2 or 3 reasons, which I haven't got time to go into any detail. But one was that the proposals from the Women's and Equalities Committee, there was a couple of pickets while they were debating the issue, and that grew. That grew amongst radical feminists. Radical feminists are not all anti-trans, by the way. There are some very good, trans-supportive arguments and articles that you will find from feminists and even from radical feminists, actually. But there is a strand of hostility that goes way back to the first, women's movement, and way back to the 70s as well, trying to exclude trans women from the women's movement. Actually, it's the second women's movement. The first one was back in 1910. So, that's one of the things I think, that was a kind of trigger for this. Secondly, I think austerity. The fact that our side has not beaten back austerity, and that austerity has been incredibly damaging over the last 12 years. The funding for LGBT support, for funding for domestic violence refugees cut by 75%, all this kind of stuff. And the failure of our trade union movement to really fight back and block this creates a political space, for potential arguments around this. And lastly, I think the low level of struggle, historically low in this country, until very recently, also is part of the issue. Okay, towards summing up, anyway. What's the Marxist approach to understanding the roots of oppression? Why is it so distinctive? And I think we don't start from human nature, which kind of dominant ideology tends to do. People talk about it's human nature for this and that. And we don't start from that. We start from the material conditions of this, that pertain in a particular society. How do we produce goods? How do we produce food? How do we distribute that? How are we organised to make that possible? What's the nature of the society that we live in? What's its driving force? And of course, in capitalism, the drive is actually to accumulate profit. It's to use our labour to generate and maximise profit. We start from that. And we start from the notion that Marx talked about in the Communist Manifesto. That the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, and I think that's a really fundamental point. This is all part of the class struggle, if you like. As classes emerged, if you go back hundreds of thousands of years, 400 of thousands of years, we lived very, very differently as human beings. We lived in groups, smallish groups. We lived in clans and so on. There wasn't a hierarchy in the sense that once you start to get wealth generated, once you start to get, an accumulation of wealth and power, well, those who control that wealth and power start to say, well, how are we going to make sure this passes on to our family, to our children? And so you get restrictions on women's sexuality, for instance. You get restrictions on forms of marriage and relationship. You get restrictions on the way how people can express themselves in terms of gender. Plenty of those societies, hunter-gatherer societies that have survived into relatively modern times, have a very different attitude towards gender. Often understood it as being very complex, several genders and so on. Not a binary system, which the ideology of capitalism, pursues. We are told, that sex is immutable, it's binary. Neither of those are true. It's much more complex than that, and that gender is bound to sex, and is also binary. The gender binary is a fundamental part of the ideology that maintains the family, the role of the family, and the nuclear family in our society. I'll just finish up, if I can, on we can come back to that in the discussion. We start as Marxists and as the SWP, when it comes to fighting oppression, any kind of oppression, we start from the reality of that oppression. We don't start from some abstract argument about what sex is. What are we talking about? Sex essentialism. We might explain why the transphobes have got it wrong, and they're on the wrong side of the history, because they are pushing this idea of sex essentialism as being fundamental. And actually, we start from oppression. We say, are trans people marginalised and oppressed? And the answer is absolutely yes. And therefore, it is the duty of socialists to stand with all the oppressed and the exploited. Lenin in the Bolsheviks talks about socialists needing to be tribunes of the oppressed, not solely concentrating on better pay or better conditions. We do that as well, of course, but actually also taking on those broader issues about how the ruling class tries to divide us through these forms of oppression. I mean, a lot of people, I think younger activists as well in the movement don't know the achievements of the Russian Revolution in terms of the social achievements. I mean, within 2 months of that revolution in 1917, early 1918, they decriminalised homosexuality. A lot of people don't know that. They were the second country in the world to do that. The first was actually after the French Revolution. So there's a theme, isn't there? Revolutions, advance, social advance, it's there. There was a whole series of things like access to divorce, abortion, children's rights, and so on that they introduced. So I'll kind of finish at this point with saying that these ideas that I've just all too briefly outlined about the nature of oppression, the roots of oppression, and where we start in terms of fighting that oppression, is not always shared by everybody that we will come across at vigils and movements and so on. Very often the dominant sort of approach is one of some form of identity theory, some form of acceptance of privilege theory, that men are privileged in relation to women, that cisgender people are privileged in relation to trans people. And I think there's a real problem with starting in that position, because what that tends to do is then kind of push, for example, cisgender people who want to offer solidarity to trans people. It kind of pushes them to the margins and says only we trans people, non-binary people, have the right to be organised and the right to fight. You can be an ally, but you're not really part of the fight. Whereas what we argue is actually it is in the interests of every working class person to join the fight and solidarise with any oppressed group. You have an interest. We have an interest, in a direct interest in fighting that oppression, because by fighting that oppression, we're fighting the forces that try and divide us and make it easier for them to stay in control. So, I would final point is this. I've seen a lot of despair actually over the last couple of weeks on social media. People, you know, really depressed about what's happened in Scotland, what's happened, you know, what happened to Brianna, and so on. And I think, and one that is, all of that is kind of horrible and difficult and poses us with all sorts of problems. Actually, we shouldn't despair, you know, because all the surveys actually show in this country that there's not a kind of a generalised hatred of trans people. There was a survey done of thousands of people last year, the More in Common survey, 5,000 people. And the conclusion from that was, I'm paraphrasing a bit, the conclusion was most people may not know very much about trans, but they are not particularly hostile. They're not opposed to trans women using, you know, women's toilets. They're not opposed to, you know, using other spaces, and so on. Often because more and more people know trans people, you know, somebody in their family, somebody at work. And the conclusion was most people approach the issue, approach individuals with a level of empathy and understanding rather than hostility. So I think we shouldn't despair. We also shouldn't despair because, just, you know, going back to the protests and so on, the protests are brilliant. You know, they're a fantastic starting point, fantastic platform to launch, you know, real campaign to roll back the attacks on trans people. And I think, you know, fundamentally, therefore, it is very much about being visible. You know, I think we have a particularly distinctive approach, actually, in the Socialist Workers' Party. We've been LGBT supportive for decades and decades. Tony Cliff, who was the founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, wrote an article back in '78 in Socialist Worker on why socialists must support gays. Now, that was not a particularly popular issue, you know, position on the left at that time. And we were very much part of that. And our comrades have been involved in trade unions and all sorts of other forums, you know, fighting to get, you know, get appropriate policies, fighting against discrimination in the workplace, and so on. So we don't despair. We mourn our dead, and we're right to do that. But we have to fight. You know, we have to fight for the living, and we have to start that fight tomorrow and the next day and keep going. Because actually, in the end, history's not on the side of the right. It's not on the side of the gender critics. It's on our side. And, you know, they'll be proved wrong, and we will win. And I'll finish on that.